So picture this. A commercial flight just vanishes from radar. And when investigators finally get to the wreckage, what they find uncovers a truth that is just absolutely shocking. We're talking about December 7th, 1987, when a totally routine flight ended in a horrifying mystery that would literally change the rules of air travel forever. You know, when first responders reached the crash site in the hills of California, they weren't looking at the recognizable shape of a plane. Not at all. They found a crater. A 30-ton airliner had been so completely and utterly obliterated that the biggest pieces they could find were no larger than your hand. Investigators did the math, and they figured the impact force was somewhere around 5,000 Gs. Now, to put that into perspective for you, the most elite, highly trained fighter pilots can maybe withstand about 9 Gs, and the human body might survive 100 Gs for just a split second in a crash. This was 50 times stronger than that, a force so incomprehensible, it explains why that aircraft was basically turned into confetti. That sheer, brutal violence of the crash scene told a story. See, planes don't just fall out of the sky like this from a simple mechanical failure. This aircraft had actually accelerated past the speed of sound, diving straight down into the ground. So from the very beginning, investigators knew this was something far, far more sinister. The flight was Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771. It was just a short commuter hop from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Super popular route. On board were 38 passengers and 5 crew members. And for the first half of that flight, everything was completely, totally normal. So back on the ground, 2 separate teams of investigators began this really grim task of sifting through all the debris. I mean, with almost no physical evidence of a plane left to even look at, they knew their only hope of solving this thing lay in finding the smallest, tiniest clues. Now, the fact that there were 2 different agencies on site was a really big deal. You had the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. They were there to figure out what caused the crash. But then you had the FBI, and they were there because they already suspected a crime had been committed. And that suspicion? It came from an absolutely chilling transmission. Just moments before the plane disappeared from radar, the pilots radioed air traffic control, and the message was frantic. "We've had a gun fired on board." That single message changed everything. This wasn't just an accident investigation anymore. It was a manhunt. In a crash this destructive, the only real witnesses left are these so-called black boxes. After hours and hours of searching, crews finally found both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. But they were horrifyingly mangled. I mean, just crushed. The big question was, could any information possibly be recovered from them? Well, against all odds, at the NTSB lab back in Washington, technicians were actually able to extract the audio tape from that crushed cockpit voice recorder. And as they hit play, the final terrifying moments of Flight 1771 were heard for the very first time. The tape starts out with a calm, totally routine flight for the first 28 minutes. And then, all of a sudden, the cockpit door opens and you hear an alarmed flight attendant's voice break the silence. "There's a problem, Captain." The captain responds immediately. His voice is calm, professional, asking what's going on, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. And then a new, unfamiliar male voice is heard. And with that one chilling declaration, the mystery was basically solved. This was a hijacking. What they heard next on the recording was the sound of gunshots as the hijacker murdered both pilots right there at the controls. So, with the recording confirming a mass murder had taken place, the investigation shifted completely to the FBI. Their mission now was clear: put a name and a face to that voice on the tape. And the evidence they needed? It was buried somewhere in that wreckage. The detective work that followed is just incredible. Agents found the murder weapon, a .44 Magnum. Then, they made this morbid but absolutely crucial discovery, a piece of a finger, stuck right in the trigger guard. From that one tiny fragment, the FBI lab lifted a perfect fingerprint, and it led them directly to a passenger on the manifest, a man named David Burke. Now, David Burke wasn't just any passenger. It turns out he was a former employee of USA Air, which was PSA's parent company. And get this, he had been fired just 3 weeks earlier for stealing $69 from in-flight liquor sales. He had a grudge, and tragically, he was on that flight. So now they had the killer, but investigators really needed to understand the motive. What was the why? Well, back in the wreckage, they found one final, damning piece of evidence that explained everything.
It was a note, written on the back of an air sickness bag.
This was Burke's message of revenge, and it was addressed to Ray Thompson, who was Burke's former boss, the man who had fired him. And, yup, Thompson was also a passenger on Flight 1771. Burke hadn't just boarded some random plane. He had targeted the exact man he blamed for all his problems. And this timeline just shows you how cold and calculated this whole thing was. The very same day his final appeal to get his job back was denied, Burke went and bought a ticket for the flight he knew his old boss took home every single week. This wasn't some spontaneous act of rage, it was a premeditated plan for revenge. So the investigation had figured out the who, the what, and the why. But one terrifying question was left for the authorities. How in the world did a recently fired, disgruntled employee manage to walk onto a commercial flight with one of the most powerful handguns in the world? The answer was a really shocking security flaw. Back in 1987, airline employees with a valid ID could use something called bypass authority to just walk around security checkpoints without being screened. When David Burke was fired, the airline never took back his credentials, so he just flashed his old ID, bypassed the metal detector, and walked right onto that plane with the .44 Magnum. The tragedy of Flight 1771 led to immediate and permanent changes. The FAA completely revoked bypass authority. It was gone. From that day forward, all airline employees, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, everybody had to go through the exact same screening as passengers. A new federal law also made it mandatory to immediately surrender all credentials upon termination. You know, the story of PSA Flight 1771 is a really horrifying reminder that so often our security measures are reactive. They're written in the aftermath of a tragedy. The loopholes that David Burke exploited were closed, for good. But it leaves us with this enduring question. In a world of ever-changing threats, how do we balance that constant need for security with our desire for convenience? It's a challenge we still face every single time we fly.